They dragged her into a back room, shaved her head, laughed while stripping her dignity, thinking she was just another black woman without power. But 10 minutes later, she walked into the courtroom, took the judge's seat, and stared down the very system that tried to erase her. What happened next? No one saw coming. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story, it is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. It began like any other morning at the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago. A sharp wind danced through the glass-paneled lobby as security lines moved with practiced rhythm. Lawyers in press suits, plaintiffs clutching files, interns typing furiously on phones. No one looked up when the tall black woman in the charcoal gray trench coat walked through the front entrance, a leather bag on her shoulder and silver-streaked hair swept into a flawless chignon. She wasn't dressed in a robe. No badge was pinned to her coat. Just confidence, quiet and unspoken. Her name was Naomi Ellison. And what no one knew, not yet, was that she was the presiding federal judge on the highest profile civil rights case that day. But before she could take her seat on the bench, she had to pass through the metal detector. That's where it happened. "Ma'am," barked the deputy at the scanner step aside. It was more command than request. Naomi paused, tilting her head, slightly puzzled. "Excuse me, random check," the deputy repeated. She was tall, broad-shouldered, white. Her nameplate read, Mercer. Her voice was clipped, her eyes unreadable. "We've had issues with people hiding things under wigs. Need you to come with me." Naomi opened her mouth to object, then caught the stares of others in line, some curious, some already looking away. She took a breath. "I don't wear a wig. You can scan my ID." Mercer didn't look at the ID. She didn't even glance. She simply stepped forward, reached out, and plucked the badge from Naomi's hand, slipping it into her pocket like it meant nothing. "This way." No one stopped her. No supervisor intervened. And so, Naomi Ellison, one of the most respected legal minds in the Midwest, was led down a silent hallway, away from cameras, past the reach of witnesses, into Security Room 4C. The door shut behind her, with a sound that felt too final. The room was stark. A metal chair, a folding table, fluorescent lights. A set of electric clippers rested beside a tray of gloves and wipes. Mercer didn't explain. She didn't need to. The smirk she wore told Naomi exactly what kind of humiliation this was. "You know," Mercer said, slipping on a pair of rubber gloves, "we've had people hide transmitters, knives, even drugs in hair like yours, especially the curly types." Naomi didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. Her pulse thrummed behind her temples, but her hands remained steady by her side. "I do not consent to any search, without probable cause," she said, "and certainly not one that involves touching my hair." Mercer's smirk hardened into something colder. "You people always want to talk legal. Let me be clear. I make the rules in this room." The clippers buzzed to life, and in the next 20 seconds, without paperwork, without oversight, without any just cause, Naomi Ellison's crown, her silver coils, each one coiled with pride, Pain and memory was stripped away. Strands fell silently fluttering to the tile floor, like feathers torn from something once dignified. Mercer worked quickly, methodically, her gloved hand pressing Naomi's head down like she was property to be handled. Not a judge, not even a person. When it was done, Mercer stepped back, brushing Naomi's curls off her own uniform like they were dust. She didn't offer a mirror, didn't offer an apology, only said, "You're clear. You can go." Naomi rose from the chair. Her scalp stung with small scratches. Her neck was damp with sweat she refused to wipe. She picked up her leather bag, walked to the door, and paused just long enough to turn I's sharp voice low. "This room will not protect you." Mercer raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Naomi didn't answer. She didn't need to. She stepped out of the room with a grace Mercer couldn't comprehend, walking past the line she'd once waited in, past officers who averted their eyes now toward Courtroom 7C. The same courtroom where in under 10 minutes she would ascend the bench. As she walked, whispers followed her. A clerk turned pale. An intern dropped his coffee. And Mercer, now back at her post, watched Naomi disappear through the double doors without understanding what she'd just done. Because Naomi hadn't walked out as a victim. She walked out as a verdict. And when she took her seat behind the elevated bench robes, donned with a slow, deliberate motion, the courtroom froze. Mercer froze. There behind the seal of the United States District Court sat the woman she had just violated, now cloaked in the authority of the very justice system Mercer had weaponized. Her shaved head caught the light like armor. Her gaze did not waver. Her voice rang clear. "Bring in the first case." And from that moment on, the story was no longer about a shaved head. It was about who dared to believe they could silence a black woman with a pair of clippers, and what happened when they failed. The quiet that followed Naomi Ellison's entrance into Courtroom 7C wasn't reverent. It was stunned. The gallery, already half filled with legal observers, civil rights attorneys, journalists, and ordinary citizens awaiting the hearing, could not reconcile the woman who had just taken the judge's bench with the woman who had walked through the lobby not 30 minutes before. Her scalp, still raw from the clippers, shimmered beneath the overhead lights. The tailored judicial robe did little to conceal what had been taken, but even less could diminish what she still carried. She didn't speak of it. She didn't need to. Because every person in that room, including Deputy Mercer, now standing just beyond the double doors in disbelief, was being forced to confront the same unspoken question. Who did you think she was? Naomi knew the answer. It had played across Mercer's face the moment their eyes met that morning. It wasn't just the assumption that she didn't belong, but the calculation that she couldn't retaliate. To Mercer, Naomi had been just another black woman, with no visible authority, no protection, no threat, just someone to control. But Naomi Ellison had never needed a badge or a robe to hold power. She had earned it long before she stepped foot into this courtroom through years of work the public rarely sees. Her rise wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, constructed brick by brick on a foundation of grit intellect and a refusal to accept invisibility. She had grown up on the south side of Chicago, raised by a librarian mother and a sanitation worker father, who taught her that books could be shields, and that silence, when weaponized by the powerful, must always be challenged. At 12, she'd watched a classmate falsely accused of theft simply because he was black. At 14, she'd written an op-ed in the school paper about policing in public schools, And at 16, when she was pulled over while walking home from debate club and told to explain why she was wandering alone, she'd stared the officer down and made him regret the question. Still, the world kept testing her. College, law school, the courts. Each step she climbed, someone waited at the next landing to ask her to prove she belonged. She proved it, again and again. Not with rage, but with unshakable excellence. But on this morning, she hadn't been asked to prove she belonged. She had been told without words that she didn't. Mercer hadn't simply doubted her identity. She had denied her humanity. And now, Naomi sat above the very room, meant to uphold that humanity, steady as ever, with nothing left to hide. Court is now in session, she said, her voice firm. She didn't reference the incident. Not yet. Instead, she presided as if her dignity hadn't been stripped bare less than an hour before, as if the courtroom's cold stares and a nation's unspoken biases weren't all bearing down on her. Each case she addressed, each motion she ruled on, every objection she sustained or overruled was done with precision, like clockwork laced with steel. But behind the ritual, the air was thick with something else reckoning. By noon, the court took a brief recess. Naomi remained seated. That's when the mayor arrived, Monica Reyes. Chicago's first Latina mayor strode into the courtroom like a storm in heels. She wasn't scheduled to be there. She hadn't sent press. She didn't take a seat. Instead, she walked straight to the bench, met Naomi's eyes, and offered a quiet nod of acknowledgement, not of rank, but of recognition. They had met years ago at a panel on justice reform. Two women of color in power navigating structures not built for them. They had spoken then about endurance. Now no words passed between them. But the silence was enough. Behind the mayor, a group of attorneys filed in, members of the Civil Rights Division, the Office of Inspector General and legal observers from the DOJ. News had reached them. Social media had exploded. The story was out. And as cameras waited outside the courthouse for a statement, Naomi stood. She removed her robe, slowly folded it over the arm of the chair, and stepped to the front of the bench. "My name is Naomi Ellison," she said. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried. "This morning, I was stopped by courthouse security. I was not asked for identification. I was not questioned professionally. I was not treated as a judge or even as a citizen. I was treated as a suspicion, a target, a problem to be neutralized." A gasp rippled through the crowd. "I do not speak today to elicit outrage. I speak because silence, though often mistaken for dignity, is too easily used as cover for injustice." She turned toward the gallery. "I was not profiled despite my role. I was profiled regardless of it. And that is the lesson. It does not matter how educated we are, how high we rise, how careful we are with our tone, our gait, our dress. To some, we are always less, until we speak." At the back of the courtroom, Mercer stood motionless. Naomi's gaze didn't flinch. "You thought I was no one," she said, addressing no one and everyone. "But I have always been someone. And so has every black woman you failed to see." And then, like a conductor, lowering her hand to end a symphony, she added, "We begin now, not with vengeance, but with truth. And this courtroom will be the first place to tell it." What followed was not a press statement or a legal argument. It was the beginning of an inquiry, a reckoning, and a new public understanding of what lived in the space between authority and assumption. Because Naomi Ellison had not just returned to the bench. She had returned with fire in her silence and justice in her breath. And she was done waiting for permission to be seen. When Naomi Ellison stepped out of the courthouse that afternoon, the city had already begun to hum with the quiet murmur of change. What began as a private humiliation had rippled into a public awakening. The footage of her shaved head, silent, unshaken, had reached millions, not because of shock value, but because something in her stillness had cracked the surface of collective denial. People were no longer just talking about her. They were remembering themselves. Within 24 hours, the Civilian Oversight Office was inundated with complaints, not about Naomi, but because of her. Her story had given others the vocabulary, the courage, the urgency to finally say what they'd been forced to swallow for years. A janitor in Seattle wrote about being routinely searched for cleaning cart contraband. A black schoolteacher from Atlanta submitted a detailed affidavit describing the time she was pulled aside in a courthouse lobby and asked if she was lost. A Muslim woman from Newark recounted being asked to remove her hijab for routine verification. All of it buried until now. Naomi had become more than a judge. She was a conduit, and she knew it. She didn't return to the bench that week, not because she was afraid, but because she was busy listening. She hosted a forum inside a modest community space just blocks from the courthouse. No press, no podium, just chairs in a circle. The flyer, printed in plain font, read, "Your story matters. Tell it where justice can hear it." They came in waves. An elderly man with a tremor in his voice told the room how 50 years ago he was dragged out of a courthouse for not responding quickly enough to a white officer's questions. A young nurse stood with her hands shaking, recalling how her brother was arrested at the same courthouse for raising his voice when trying to defend her from a pat-down. A teenage girl named Amara quietly explained how she avoided court buildings altogether after her mother, dressed in traditional African attire, was laughed at and forced to remove her head wrap before a juvenile custody hearing. Naomi sat among them, not as a judge, but as one of many. She didn't interrupt. She didn't moderate. She only asked one question again and again. What did it take from you? And the answers came. My trust. My peace. My ability to believe I mattered. One woman whispered, "It made me small." Naomi never took notes. She memorized every voice instead. By the end of the week, the forum had to move into a larger space, then another. Within 2 weeks, it had evolved into what the city began to call the Truth Circle, a gathering of those who had long lived in the shadows of respectability politics and selective justice. There were no titles at the door, no badges, just stories, some brutal, some quiet, all of them true. Naomi knew that public reckoning could not exist without personal reckoning. And so she returned to the courthouse, not to the bench, but to the very security checkpoint where it began. She walked through the metal detector again, this time without hesitation. She met the eyes of every officer there. Some looked away. Others nodded stiffly, unsure how to navigate her presence. The buzz of the scanner passed over her. No one moved to stop her. No one asked to search her, but that didn't mean the lesson had landed. Naomi turned to the small waiting area behind the checkpoint and addressed the people standing in line. "I know this space doesn't always feel like it belongs to you," she said quietly, "but it does. Justice is yours to demand, not just to receive." Then she stepped away. That same day, she issued an open letter published in every major newspaper in the state. It wasn't an accusation. It was a declaration. "I am not the first to be humiliated under the guise of protocol," she wrote. but I intend to be one of the last. The walls of our institutions cannot keep standing if they only shelter some and expose others. A checkpoint is meant to protect, not degrade. And every person who walks through these doors deserves to be met with dignity, not suspicion. She proposed the creation of a Citizens Accountability Council composed of individuals with lived experience of institutional discrimination, tasked with reviewing complaints, shaping policy, and most importantly, ensuring no story was lost to bureaucracy again. The idea ignited a spark. Civil rights organizations signed on. State lawmakers reached out. Community leaders volunteered to serve. And across social media, a hashtag began to trend. She did not bow. It was more than a slogan. It became a movement. Women posted their own stories under it, some harrowing, others heartbreakingly mundane. A woman in North Carolina recounted how she was once asked if the child she was holding in court was hers. A woman in Detroit said she had to bring her white co-worker to court just to avoid being mistaken for a defendant. Each story echoed the one before it. Each voice amplified the next. Naomi saw her own pain mirrored in every syllable. She didn't want fame. She wanted correction. And correction, she believed, required more than consequence. It needed confession. So she requested a formal review of the entire courthouse's security division, starting with Deputy Marjorie Mercer. Not because it would satisfy the public, but because it was necessary for the process to mean something. The review was not designed to humiliate. It was designed to reveal. And when Mercer sat before the ethics board, no longer in her uniform stripped of the invisible armor power often provides, she didn't protest. She didn't excuse. She only whispered, "I didn't know who she was." To which the lead investigator replied, "That's the problem. You didn't think she could be anyone." Naomi never attended the hearing. She didn't need to. Because she had already started something larger than a reprimand. She had cracked open a silence that spanned generations, and now the echo of every silenced voice was not only being heard, it was being recorded, in policy, in memory, in the unshakable presence of a woman who refused to disappear. Naomi Ellison had taken her pain and offered it up as a doorway, and now others were walking through. The courthouse once held the hush of power, an oppressive silence dressed in formality, where echoes were not made by truth, but by fear. Naomi Ellison had heard that silence all her life. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of exclusion. And now she had decided that silence would no longer be the background music to justice. Not in her courtroom. Not under her watch. When she stepped back onto the bench, her scalp still bare, her gaze steady, the room didn't erupt. It listened. There was no applause, no grandstanding, just awareness. Every person who sat in that courtroom knew something had shifted. The weight in the room was different, not heavier, just undeniable. Naomi wasn't interested in fanfare. Her power didn't come from spectacle. It came from principle. And in the days that followed, she used that principle to build something radical, not through revolution, but through resolve. She convened a roundtable of court staff, defense attorneys, bailiffs, clerks, even janitorial staff, anyone who participated in the daily machinery of justice. No titles, no rank, just a single question written on the whiteboard. How do we ensure no one is ever invisible again? For 3 hours, they spoke, some nervously, some angrily, but all honestly. A young court translator admitted that she had been reprimanded for speaking too gently to a Spanish-speaking mother on trial. A middle-aged white clerk confessed that she'd often felt something was wrong with how security profiled visitors, but didn't know how to speak up. A retired courtroom sketch artist shared a drawing she once kept hidden a black woman being body searched behind closed doors, her posture straight, her eyes averted. She said she'd drawn it from memory after witnessing the moment and being told not to include it in the courtroom log. Naomi listened. Every voice mattered. Not because they offered solutions, but because they revealed the silent architecture of a broken culture. Then she unveiled the dignity protocol. It wasn't a policy, it was a practice. It began with eye contact, with acknowledgement, with mandatory training sessions led by survivors of court discrimination, not activists from afar, but citizens from within the city. It required staff to log any interaction that resulted in physical inspection, to provide written explanation, and most radically to allow individuals to submit their own narrative of what happened. You don't just log an event, Naomi told them. You log the experience. Resistance came as expected. Some officers pushed back. Some administrators claimed it would slow operations. But Naomi held firm. Justice isn't fast food, she said. It's sacred work, and sacred work takes time. She introduced the Open Courthouse Project, a pilot initiative that invited students, community leaders, and ordinary residents to witness daily court proceedings. Not high-profile trials, just the grind of routine cases. The ones no one ever films, the ones where implicit bias hides best. They watched. They took notes. They asked questions. And slowly the building changed. Security officers who had once dismissed community members as threats now greeted them at the door. Clerks asked for pronunciation guides on unfamiliar names. A defense attorney began writing reflections after each case detailing whether he'd carried unconscious assumptions based on appearance. Naomi watched it all unfold, not with pride, but with purpose. One day, a woman walked into her chambers carrying a file folder. "I'm not here to complain," she said. "I'm here to contribute." She was once denied entry into the courthouse for wearing a traditional Jeel head wrap. She now wanted to help write a cultural competency module for court security staff. Justice, Naomi realized, had never been a visitor. It had always been waiting to be invited in. And now that it had a place at the table, it would not leave quietly. She stood on the courthouse steps later that week, not for a press event, but to greet a group of local students arriving for the open courthouse tour. A boy, no older than 16, stared up at her with a quiet reverence. "You really run this whole building?" he asked. Naomi smiled. "No," she said. "I make sure everyone here remembers who it belongs to." He nodded slowly, then whispered, "My sister says she wants to be like you." Naomi paused, looked at him, and said, "Tell her not to be like me. Tell her to be louder." Because justice wasn't made to tiptoe in. It was made to enter like thunder, to stand where silence had been planted, and to speak in the voices too long ignored. And in that moment, Naomi knew she hadn't returned to the bench. She had returned to battle, one she would never wage with rage but with relentless integrity. Because justice is not a quiet visitor. It is a voice, and now it was hers. Naomi Ellison didn't remember what day of the week it was, but she remembered the feeling. The morning sunlight had just crept through the narrow windows of the Charleston Federal Courthouse. The building buzzed with its usual rhythm footsteps, echoing against marble-hushed voices behind oak doors and the creak of leather shoes as bailiffs crossed between chambers. But something was different. It wasn't in the air, or in the walls, or in the silence that followed Naomi's slow walk into the courtroom that morning. It was in the people. They were already there, dozens of them. Staff visitors, junior clerks, janitors, even members of the public who had arrived early and taken their seats quietly. Some wore suits. Some wore jeans and t-shirts. Some clutched files. Others just carried stories. No one had called for them. No one had sent out an invitation. But they were there. Naomi entered the courtroom, with her head bare, her presence unguarded. She was no longer the woman walking in from scandal, nor the figure cloaked in tension. She was simply Naomi, a judge, a woman, a survivor, a protector of the bench and everything it was meant to represent. She hadn't spoken a word yet when the first person stood. It was a law intern, a young black woman Naomi had once mentored briefly in a hallway conversation months earlier. She stood silently, her hand over her heart, her eyes fixed not on Naomi's shaved head or her robes, but on her dignity. Then a second person stood, an older court reporter, white, male, retired and known to have been indifferent to most reform conversations. He stood with his back straight and eyes downcast as if understanding had arrived too late, but wanting to stand anyway. Then another, and another. Within moments, the courtroom row by row rose to its feet. No anthem played, no flag was raised. But there was reverence in the air so full it felt like thunder waiting to roll. Naomi froze for half a breath. In a world that had tried to strip her of everything, privacy, safety, respect, this moment returned it all in silence. Not through titles, not through sympathy, but through witness. She stepped toward the bench, but this time her body moved with the steadiness of a woman who had seen every layer of the system, its failures, its fractures, and still chose to carry it forward. No announcement was made. She simply sat. And yet they kept standing, not as ritual, but as rebellion. This was their declaration that what had been done to her under the guise of protocol beneath the veil of authority had not gone unseen, that what she had built after justice with transparency, accountability without vengeance, was now their burden to share. A bailiff cleared his throat softly, his voice uncertain. All rise, he began out of habit, but they already had. Naomi offered a slight nod and spoke not to open court, but to acknowledge the unspoken. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not for standing for me, but for standing for what this room is supposed to mean. They sat, but something had stayed standing inside them, something that would not return to sleep. Later that afternoon, Naomi passed through the hallway toward her chambers. A young boy sat on a bench beside his mother, holding a notebook covered in stickers. He saw her and smiled. I told my teacher today, he said, that I met the woman who made courtrooms fair. Naomi blinked slowly, that ache in her throat rising again not from sorrow, but from awe. It wasn't her story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt the burn of dismissal, the sting of judgment, the cold grip of systemic silence, and still dared to demand more. That day wasn't about Naomi Ellison being honored. It was about justice being restored by people who had once been told their presence didn't matter. And when they stood for her, they didn't raise her up. They raised the floor beneath them all. Naomi Ellison's story began like many stories of injustice in silence. A routine morning, a familiar hallway, and a uniform that was meant to serve, not strip. She walked into the Charleston federal courthouse that day as a respected judge, a woman of principle, and a lifelong believer in the system. But to those who saw only her skin, her gender, her hair, she was something less, unrecognizable, unworthy. What happened to her wasn't just a violation of her rights, it was a betrayal of everything the courtroom stood for. Her head was shaved in a back room, not for security, but for control. It was an act not of law, but of power, masquerading as law. And yet what followed wasn't revenge. Naomi did not meet cruelty with cruelty. She met it with clarity, resolve, and a determination to transform personal pain into public progress. She could have retreated, could have worn a wig, avoided the cameras, transferred quietly out of state. But Naomi chose to stand. In doing so, she turned the courtroom not into a theater of retribution, but into a living pulse of accountability. She called names. She exposed patterns. She cracked open a system that for too long had mistaken silence for order. And people listened. From the intern who stood for her on the morning, she returned to the janitor who placed a hand over his heart. When she passed, Naomi's quiet defiance awakened something the city didn't know. It was starving for truth that did not apologize for being loud. Her scars, both visible and unseen, became the ink of new laws, new standards, and new belief. The Rhodes Act. The sweeping reform she helped write did more than change procedure. It reminded institutions what justice should feel like: human, accountable, alive. But this story is not just about a woman in a robe. It's about every person who's ever been told they didn't belong. Every woman humiliated behind closed doors. Every black professional questioned for daring to exist in spaces they'd earned the right to enter. Naomi's journey is a mirror. And when we look into it, we're asked a single question: will we stand up when it's our turn to be counted? The lesson is this: dignity can be taken, but never destroyed. True power isn't loud or showy. It's quiet, unshaken. It walks back into the room where it was broken and reclaims it. That's what Naomi did. That's what we must all learn to do, not just when the cameras are rolling, but when no one is watching. In your daily life, this means standing up in your workplace when something's wrong. It means teaching your children the difference between authority and accountability. It means listening when someone says they were mistreated, even if the system insists otherwise. It means refusing to normalize disrespect, no matter how common it becomes. Naomi's story may be finished on paper, but it's only beginning in practice. It lives every time we demand better from our leaders. Every time we lift up someone who's been pushed aside. Every time we say, "Not this time, not again, not here." If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of someone you know, or maybe even something you've survived, then don't let it end with you. Subscribe to this channel. Help us keep telling the stories they don't want told. The stories that hurt, that heal, that hold power to the light. Your support gives us the strength to continue. And together, we won't just witness justice, we'll build it.